The longest Tuesday. Gerald Whitmore woke up at 6:47 in the morning, which was 3 minutes before his alarm was set to go off, and he lay there for those 3 minutes doing absolutely nothing in particular. He wasn't thinking about anything important, he wasn't dreaming. He was simply lying on his back, staring at a small water stain on the ceiling that had been there for years and that he had, at various points, meant to ask his landlord about, though he never had, and probably never would, because it wasn't really bothering anyone. When the alarm did go off, it played the default marimba tone that came pre-installed on his phone, the one everybody has, the one that sounds vaguely like a xylophone being played underwater. Gerald reached over, turned it off, and sat up slowly, the way people do when they are not in any particular hurry and have nowhere urgent to be. He had somewhere to be, he had work, but he was not, by nature, a person who hurried. He got out of bed and walked to the bathroom, and along the way he noticed that the hallway carpet needed vacuuming, a thought that occurred to him roughly 4 mornings out of 7 and that he acted on roughly 1 morning out of 10. In the bathroom he brushed his teeth for what he estimated was about 90 seconds, though he did not time it, using a soft bristle toothbrush with worn-down bristles that he also meant to replace and also had not replaced. The toothpaste was mint-flavored. It was always mint-flavored. He had never once, in his adult life, purchased a non-mint-flavored toothpaste, not out of any strong conviction, but simply because mint was what was usually on the shelf at eye level, and reaching for something else would have required a decision he didn't feel like making. After brushing his teeth he examined his face in the mirror for a moment, the way people do, not out of vanity but out of a kind of habitual checking. The same impulse that makes you pet your pocket to make sure your phone is there even when you already know it is. His face looked the same as it had looked the day before. He had a small patch of stubble near his jaw that the razor tended to miss, and he decided, as he decided most mornings, that he would deal with it tomorrow. Downstairs, in the kitchen, Gerald made coffee using a drip machine that was 11 years old and had a slightly cracked handle on the carafe, held together at some point with a strip of clear packing tape that had since yellowed slightly at the edges. He measured out the coffee grounds using a metal scoop, 2 scoops for the pot, which made 4 cups, though he only ever drank 1 full cup in part of a second before he had to leave for work, and the rest sat in the carafe getting cold and slightly bitter, which didn't bother him because he mostly just poured it out later without tasting it. While the coffee brewed, making its small percolating sounds, Gerald opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it for a while, the door held open with one hand, the cool air drifting out over his bare feet. There wasn't much to see: a carton of eggs, about half used, a jar of strawberry jam with a thin crust of dried jam around the rim of the lid, some sliced turkey in a resealable bag, a bottle of ketchup, 2 lemons that had been there long enough that one of them was starting to develop a soft spot on one side, which Gerald noticed and thought, again, that he should probably use soon, or throw away, and did neither. He decided on toast. He took 2 slices of white bread from a bag that was closed with a twist tie, and he put them in the toaster, a plain to-slot toaster with a dial that went from 1 to 6, and he set it to 4. Which was where he always set it, because he had determined some years ago that 4 was the correct setting for the way he liked his toast, not too pale and not too dark, and he had never seen any reason to experiment with 3 or 5. The toast popped up while he was pouring his coffee into a mug that had a faded picture of a lighthouse on it, a mug he'd owned since a work conference some years back, one of those giveaway mugs that companies hand out. And he had kept it not because he particularly liked lighthouses but because it was a perfectly functional mug and he saw no reason to replace a perfectly functional mug. He spread butter on the toast, then the strawberry jam, using the same knife for both, which meant a small amount of butter always ended up in the jam jar and a small amount of jam always ended up in the butter dish, and this had been going on for so long that both containers had a permanent faint smear of the other substance around their edges. He ate the toast standing up, leaning against the counter, looking out the kitchen window at the small backyard, which contained a patch of grass that needed mowing, a plastic chair that had tipped over at some point during the last windstorm and that he had not yet stood back up, and a bird feeder that was empty, though a few sparrows still visited it out of habit or hope, hopping along the little perch and finding nothing and flying off again. At 7, 15. Gerald went back upstairs to get dressed. He worked at a mid-sized company that processed insurance claims, in a department that handled what were internally called low-complexity residential submissions, which meant claims for things like a broken fence panel or a cracked window. Nothing dramatic, nothing that made the news, just steady small damages that people filed forms about and that Gerald and his colleagues reviewed, checked against policy limits, and either approved or sent back for additional documentation. He had worked there for 6 years. He did not dislike the job. He also did not particularly like it. It was, in his mind, simply the job, the way the toast was simply toast, and the coffee was simply coffee. He put on a pair of gray trousers and a light blue button-down shirt, one of 5 nearly identical light blue button-down shirts he owned, purchased in a single transaction some years prior after he had decided that having several of the same shirt eliminated the need to think about what shirt to wear. He put on socks, one gray and one that was almost but not quite the same shade of gray, close enough that he didn't notice, and wouldn't he have cared if he had. He put on his shoes, brown leather shoes with laces, and he tied them the way he always tied them, without really watching his hands do it, because his hands had done it so many thousands of times that they no longer required supervision. At 7:30 he left the house, locking the door behind him, checking the handle once by giving it a small tug, the way people do, and walked to his car, a silver sedan that was neither particularly new nor particularly old, that ran fine, that had a small dent in the rear bumper from a parking lot incident 2 years ago that he had never bothered to get fixed because it didn't affect how the car drove, and fixing it would have meant taking time off work to sit in a repair shop waiting room, which seemed like more trouble than the dent was worth. The drive to work took 19 minutes on a normal day, and it was a normal day. He drove the same route he always drove, down Maple, left onto Fenwick, straight through to Lights, right onto the road that ran alongside the shopping plaza with the grocery store and the dry cleaner and the shop that sold vacuum cleaners and vacuum cleaner parts, a shop Gerald had walked past hundreds of times and never once entered, though he sometimes wondered, idly, at red lights, what exactly was inside, what kind of person needed vacuum cleaner parts specifically, and how that shop managed to stay in business, questions he never looked into and never would. At the second light, a red one, he waited through a full cycle because he arrived just as it turned red, and he sat there with his hands at a relaxed tan into position on the wheel, and the radio was on, tuned to a station that played a mix of older pop songs, and a song was playing that he recognized but couldn't have named, something from maybe 15 years ago, mid-tempo, forgettable, the kind of song that exists mostly to fill space between other songs, and he did not turn it up or down. He simply let it play, tapping one finger lightly against the wheel, not quite in time with the beat. He arrived at the office at 7:51, parked in his usual spot, not assigned but understood among the employees to be his because he always parked there, 3rd row, 4th space from the end, near a concrete pillar with a chip out of one corner. He walked in through the side entrance, badged in with his employee card, a small beep and a green light, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor, standing in the elevator alongside 2 other people he recognized but did not know well, and nobody spoke, because it was early and the ride was short and there was nothing in particular that needed saying. At his desk, Gerald logged into his computer, which took, as it always did, somewhere between 40 and 90 seconds to fully load everything, during which time he took a sip of coffee from a paper cup he'd picked up from the break room on his way in, and he looked at the small calendar on his desk, a desk calendar with a different photograph of a national park for each month, currently displaying a photograph of a canyon somewhere he had never been and had no particular plans to visit, though. The photograph was, he thought, in a vague and unexamined way, nice. The first email in his inbox that morning was from a colleague named Patricia, in the next row of cubicles, asking whether he had received the batch of claims that had been reassigned from someone on medical leave. He had. He replied to say so, 4 words, yes, got them, thanks, and then he opened the first claim in the batch. It was a claim regarding a fence. A homeowner in a town about 40 minutes from the office had reported that a section of their wooden fence, roughly 8 feet long, had been damaged during a storm the previous month, and they had submitted photographs, 3 of them, showing the fence from slightly different angles, all depicting essentially the same thing, Several wooden slats knocked loose or split, nothing structural, no other property damage mentioned in the report. Gerald reviewed the photographs, cross-referenced the policy number, confirmed the coverage limits, checked that the claimed repair estimate, which had been submitted by a local contractor and totaled $612, fell within reasonable bounds for that type of repair in that region, which it did, comfortably, and he approved the claim. This took him about 6 minutes. He moved to the next one. The next claim concerned a cracked basement window, again from the same storm, a different household. The homeowner had submitted a single photograph and a repair quote from a glass company for $340. Gerald checked the same things he always checked: policy number, coverage limits, whether the described damage matched what was shown in the photograph, whether the estimate was reasonable, and he approved this one too. A little faster than the first, in about 4 minutes, because the documentation was clean and there was nothing that required a second look. He worked through the queue in this fashion for the rest of the morning. A gutter that had come loose, a touche door that no longer closed properly, a section of vinyl siding that had cracked. None of it was interesting, and none of it was meant to be. It was the kind of work that, when done correctly, produced no story at all, just a series of small, quiet resolutions: a homeowner somewhere getting a check in the mail eventually, a fence getting repaired, a life continuing exactly as it had before the storm, with one minor inconvenience corrected. At 10:15 there was a break, unofficial, the kind that happens because people need to stretch their legs, and Gerald walked to the break room, where a coworker named Doug was refilling the paper towel dispenser. A task Doug seemed to have unofficially adopted as his own over the years, and Doug said, "Morning," and Gerald said, "Morning," and that was the entire exchange, and both of them seemed satisfied with it. Gerald poured himself another cup of coffee, this one from the break room machine rather than the one he brought from home, and he stood by the window for a minute or two, looking out at the parking lot, at the row of cars, at a bit of trash, a plastic bag, that was blowing slowly across the far end of the lot, catching briefly on a curb, releasing, drifting a bit further, catching again. He watched it do this 3 or 4 times before he lost interest and went back to his desk. Lunch was at noon. He had brought a sandwich from home, turkey and the same strawberry jam adjacent butter situation, though for the sandwich he had used a clean edge of both containers, out of some vague sense that sandwiches deserved slightly more care than toast. He ate it at his desk while scrolling through a news app on his phone, reading headlines without clicking most of them, occasionally reading a full article about something mildly interesting, a bridge somewhere undergoing repairs, a minor change to a tax regulation that wouldn't affect him, and then setting the phone down and finishing his sandwich in silence. The afternoon proceeded much like the morning had: more claims, a tree branch that had fallen on a shed roof, a mailbox knocked off its post. Around 2:30, Gerald's eyes felt a little tired, the particular tiredness that comes from looking at a screen for several consecutive hours, and he blinked several times, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and kept working. At 3:45 there was a brief meeting, 15 minutes, in which his supervisor, a woman named Carla, reminded the team about an upcoming software update that would change the formatting of the claims dashboard slightly. Nothing major, just a new column that would display the date of the original incident more prominently. Several people asked questions. The questions were reasonable and the answers were straightforward, and the meeting ended 2 minutes early, which nobody commented on but which everyone seemed quietly pleased about. Gerald left the office at 3 minutes after his official end time, because he had wanted to finish the claim he was on rather than leave it half-reviewed. The drive home took slightly longer than the drive-in, 26 minutes instead of 19, due to a bit of traffic near the shopping plaza. Nothing serious, just enough cars that the light didn't clear in a single cycle. He listened to the same radio station, another forgettable song played. He did not mind. At home, he changed out of his work clothes into a t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants that had a small hole near one knee, and he sat on the couch for a while before deciding what to do about dinner. He settled on reheating some leftover rice and vegetables from 2 nights before, which took about 4 minutes in the microwave. during which he stood in the kitchen watching the plate rotate slowly behind the little window, not because it was interesting but because there wasn't anything else to look at in that particular moment. He ate dinner in front of the television, watching a rerun of a home renovation show he had seen the episode of before, though he didn't remember this until about 10 minutes in, when a particular kitchen backsplash looked familiar. He watched it anyway. There was something soothing about watching a show whose ending you already knew, a small measure of certainty in an evening that otherwise had none of any particular consequence. After dinner he washed his one plate, one fork, and the pot he'd used to heat the rice, and he set them in the drying rack, and he wiped down the counter with a dish towel that could probably have used washing itself, and then he sat back down and scrolled through his phone for a while, reading nothing in particular, looking at photos other people had posted of meals and vacations and pets, feeling nothing strongly about any of it, the way you feel nothing strongly about most things on most ordinary evenings. At around 9:40, he began getting ready for bed. He brushed his teeth again, the same mint toothpaste, the same worn-down brush. He set his alarm for 6:40 for the next morning, 3 minutes before it needed to go off, a habit he'd never examined the reasoning behind. He turned off the lights, one by one, moving through the house, kitchen light, hallway light, bathroom light, and he got into bed and lay on his back for a while, looking at the same water stain on the ceiling, the one he still hadn't asked the landlord about, and he thought, vaguely, about nothing at all, and after a while, without any clear sense of the moment it happened, he fell asleep. The next day was a Wednesday and it began, more or less, exactly the same way. Gerald woke at 6:44, 3 minutes before his alarm, and lay still for those 3 minutes, and when the marimba tone sounded he silenced it and sat up. The water stain on the ceiling was there, unchanged, the way water stains generally are once they've finished forming. He walked to the bathroom. The hallway carpet, he noticed, still needed vacuuming. It occurred to him this was now 5 mornings in a row that he had noticed this, which struck him as a minor personal record, though not one he felt any particular urge to correct. He brushed his teeth for approximately 90 seconds with the same soft, worn brush, and he looked at his face in the mirror, and the patch of stubble near his jaw was, if anything, slightly more noticeable than the day before, and he decided, as he had decided the day before, that he would deal with it tomorrow. A decision that was beginning to take on the quality of a small tradition rather than a postponement. Downstairs, he made coffee, 2 scoops in the drip machine with the cracked, taped handle, and while it brewed he opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it. The soft spot on the one lemon had grown very slightly larger. He noted this the way you might note a change in the weather, without much feeling attached to it, and he closed the refrigerator and made toast, setting the dial to 4. The way he always did, and the toast came out the way it always came out, not too pale, not too dark, and he ate it standing at the counter, looking out at the yard, at the overturned plastic chair, which was still overturned, at the empty bird feeder, which a single sparrow visited briefly and then abandoned, apparently. Unsurprised to find it empty again, as though it had come more out of routine than expectation. He dressed in the same manner as the day before. Gray trousers, one of the 5 light blue shirts, though not the same one, since he rotated them without really tracking which one he'd worn when, and it was entirely possible, though he never checked, that he sometimes wore the same shirt twice in a row without noticing, and if he did, nobody at the office seemed to notice either, or if they noticed, nobody mentioned it, which amounted to the same thing in practice. The drive to work took 21 minutes this time. 2 minutes longer than usual, because of a delivery truck idling in front of the dry cleaner near the shopping plaza, its hazard lights blinking, a driver inside apparently checking something on a clipboard, in no hurry, and the cars behind it had to merge one at a time around it, and Gerald merged along with everyone else without any particular impatience, because 2 extra minutes was not the kind of thing that struck him as worth being impatient about. At the office, he badged in, took the elevator, said nothing to the 2 people riding up with him, both different people than the day before, and sat down at his desk, and the computer took, this time, about 70 seconds to load. The desk calendar still showed the canyon photograph, since it was still the same month, and Gerald looked at it again, briefly, the way you might glance at a photograph you've already looked at many times, seeing it without really seeing it. The first claim of the day involved a mailbox, knocked from its post, apparently by a delivery truck backing up carelessly in the homeowner's driveway, though the claim form didn't specify this, only noting vehicle contact, mailbox destroyed, with a photograph showing the post lying at an angle in the grass, the mailbox itself a few feet away, dented on one side. The repair estimate was modest, $85, covering a new post and a replacement mailbox of similar size and style to the one that had been damaged. Gerald checked the policy, checked the estimate against typical costs for that kind of repair, found nothing out of order, and approved it in about 5 minutes. He continued through the queue for the rest of the morning in the same unhurried, methodical way. A garage door that had come off one of its tracks. A section of guttering, again, this time from a different house entirely, unrelated to the one from the day before, though the description in the claim form was almost word for word identical, which Gerald noted with a small, private amusement that he did not share with anyone, since there was no one nearby to share it with, and it wasn't really funny enough to interrupt anyone's work over. Around 10:30, Doug was in the break room again, this time not refilling paper towels but wiping down the counter beside the coffee machine, where someone had apparently spilled sugar earlier that morning and not cleaned it up, and Doug was doing so now with the particular thoroughness of someone who took a quiet pride in maintaining shared spaces that nobody had asked him to maintain. He said, "Morning," to Gerald, again, despite it now being closer to 11, and Gerald said, "Morning," back, and neither of them seemed to think anything of the fact that morning was, technically, no longer quite accurate. Lunch was another sandwich, turkey again, because the turkey in the refrigerator needed using before it went bad, and Gerald had decided, without much deliberation, that eating the same lunch 2 days in a row was the more efficient path forward, efficiency being a quality he valued not out of any particular ambition but simply because it required less thinking, and less thinking, on an ordinary Wednesday, was generally what he preferred. The afternoon claims included a fence again, a different fence, a different homeowner, a similar amount of damage, and a claim regarding a small crack in a driveway, which required a bit more scrutiny than usual, since driveway cracks could sometimes be pre-existing rather than storm-related, and Gerald examined the photographs closely, comparing the angle and depth of the crack against what might reasonably be expected from the kind of impact described, weighing the report from the contractor, who had noted the crack appeared consistent with impact from fallen debris, and ultimately Gerald approved the claim, though it took him closer to 12 minutes rather than the usual 5 or 6, and he made a small note in the file indicating his reasoning, in case anyone reviewed it later, which they generally didn't. But the habit of documenting reasoning was one he developed early in his time at the company and never abandoned. At 3:45 there was no meeting that day, which Gerald noted with a faint, undramatic sense of relief, the way you might feel mild relief upon realizing you don't need to stop for gas after all. A relief so small it barely registered as an emotion at all, more like the absence of a minor inconvenience than the presence of anything positive. He left at 5:01 and drove home in 18 minutes, slightly faster than usual, since the delivery truck from the morning was long gone and the light near the shopping plaza cleared on the first cycle. The radio played a different forgettable song, this one with a saxophone solo somewhere in the middle that Gerald found mildly pleasant, though not pleasant enough to make him wait in the car after he departed to hear the rest of it, and he turned the car off partway through the solo and went inside. Dinner that evening was pasta, a box of dried spaghetti and a jar of tomato sauce that he heated on the stove while the pasta boiled, and he ate it at the small kitchen table rather than in front of the television, for no particular reason except that the remote was across the room and he didn't feel like getting up to retrieve it once he sat down. He looked, instead, at a magazine that had come in the mail some weeks prior, a subscription he signed up for during a moment of impulse at an airport and never quite gotten around to canceling, and he flipped through an article about home organization systems, reading perhaps a third of it before losing interest and turning instead to an article about a small town somewhere that had recently opened a new library, which he read in full, mostly because the photographs were nice, showing tall windows and rows of shelves and a reading room with soft chairs, and he thought, for a moment, that it looked like a pleasant place to spend an afternoon, though he had no plans to travel there and probably never would. After dinner, he washed the pot and the plate and the fork, the same small routine as the night before, and he sat on the couch for a while, and this time he did turn on the television, watching part of a documentary about the migration patterns of a particular species of bird, something he had not sought out specifically but had simply landed on while scrolling through channels, and he found it mildly interesting in the way that nature documentaries often are: pleasant narration, calm music, footage of birds flying in formation over some coastline, and he watched about 40 minutes of it before deciding he was tired enough to go to bed, even though it was only 9:15, earlier than his usual bedtime. But Wednesdays, he had noticed over the years, tended to leave him a little more tired than other days, for reasons he had never bothered to examine. He brushed his teeth, checked the alarm, turned off the lights room by room, and lay down, and the water stain was there, as always, and he thought about the library with the tall windows for a moment, and then he thought about nothing, and then he was asleep. Thursday began at 6:44 again, 3 minutes before the alarm, which Gerald was beginning to think might not be a coincidence at all but some quiet internal clock that simply preferred waking a few minutes ahead of being told to. He got up, went through the same sequence: bathroom, teeth, face in the mirror, stubble noted and deferred, and went downstairs, where the coffee machine performed its small percolating ritual and the refrigerator revealed the same lemon, now with a soft spot large enough that Gerald finally decided, standing there with the door open, that he would throw it away, and he did, dropping it into the small bin under the sink, and he felt a brief, disproportionate satisfaction at having finally resolved a matter that had been quietly pending for the better part of a week. The toast was set to 4. The chair in the yard remained overturned. No sparrows visited the feeder that particular morning, though Gerald didn't notice their absence so much as failed to notice their presence, which is a slightly different thing, and not something he would have been able to articulate if asked. The drive to work took its usual 19 minutes. The radio played a song Gerald actually recognized the name of, an older song by a band he'd listened to somewhat more in his 20s, and he turned the volume up to notches, not dramatically, just enough to notice, and he hummed along under his breath at the chorus, not the full melody, just a few notes here and there, the way people do when they know a song well enough to feel it but not well enough to sing it properly. At the office, the day proceeded through its familiar shapes. Claims about fences, about gutters, about a tree limb that had come down across a walkway, about a shutter that had come loose from its hinges and now hung at an angle that the homeowner had described, in the claim narrative, as kind of sad-looking, a phrase that made Gerald smile slightly before he moved on to reviewing the actual damage assessment. He approved most of what crossed his desk that day, sent one claim back requesting an additional photograph because the angle in the submitted image made it hard to judge the extent of the damage, and had, generally, an entirely unremarkable Thursday. At lunch, Patricia from the next row of cubicles stopped by his desk to ask if he wanted to split an order of something from the sandwich shop 2 blocks from the office, since she was placing an order for herself and it was easier to place one larger order than 2 smaller ones. Something about a minimum for the delivery fee, and Gerald said sure, and ordered a turkey sandwich, which was, he realized as he said it, almost exactly what he already had at home in his lunch bag, and he ended up eating both, the delivered one first and the one from home later in the afternoon as a kind of snack, which struck him as slightly wasteful, though not wasteful enough to trouble him for more than the few seconds it took to think about it. The delivered sandwich arrived at 12:40, brought up by a young man wearing a jacket with the sandwich shop's logo on the back, and Gerald and Patricia ate at their respective desks, occasionally exchanging a few words over the low cubicle wall between them. Nothing of substance. A comment about the weather, which had turned slightly overcast. A comment about the software update that was still scheduled for the following week, whether it would actually happen on time given that these updates were, historically, more often delayed than not. The afternoon brought more claims, a slow and steady procession of small domestic damages, none of them dramatic, none of them requiring anything beyond Gerald's usual careful, unhurried attention. Around 3 o'clock he got up to refill his water bottle at the cooler near the break room, and on the way back he passed a window that looked out over the parking lot, and he noticed it had begun, very lightly, to rain. not enough to really be called rain so much as a kind of fine mist, barely visible except against the darker asphalt of the lot, and he watched it for a moment before returning to his desk. He left work at 5:00 exactly that day, having finished the last claim in his queue with a few minutes to spare, and the drive home took 22 minutes due to the light rain, which had picked up slightly and made a few of the intersections a bit more cautious than usual. Cars braking a touch earlier, a bit more space kept between vehicles, though nothing that could be described as heavy traffic, just a general, mild slowing of the ordinary rhythm. At home, he changed into the same t-shirt and sweatpants with the hole near the knee, and for dinner he decided, somewhat unusually, to actually cook something rather than reheat or assemble something simple, and he made a stir-fry with a bag of frozen vegetables and some chicken breast he had in the freezer, seasoning it with soy sauce and a bit of garlic powder from a jar that had been in his spice cabinet long enough that the label had started to fade. It took him about 25 minutes, including the time spent thawing the chicken slightly in a bowl of warm water, and he ate it in front of the television, watching the local news, which covered a story about road construction on a stretch of highway he rarely used, a story about a local school fundraiser, and a weather segment noting that the light rain from earlier would likely continue into the evening before clearing overnight. After dinner, he did the dishes, which took slightly longer than usual since he used a cutting board and a knife in addition to the usual plate and fork, and he dried his hands on the dish towel that really did need washing at this point, and he made a mental note to wash it over the weekend. A note that joined several other mental notes he'd been carrying for some time regarding minor domestic tasks, the vacuuming, the razor missing that patch near his jaw, the landlord and the water stain. None of them urgent, all of them lingering in the pleasant, low-stakes way that small undone tasks tend to linger in a life that is otherwise running smoothly. He spent the rest of the evening reading, an actual book this time rather than a magazine, a novel he'd started some weeks earlier and had been making slow, steady progress through, a few chapters a week, nothing that gripped him urgently but something he found reliably pleasant to return to, the way you might return to a familiar walking route. He read for about an hour, finishing a chapter and starting the next before deciding he was tired enough to stop, and he went to bed a little after 10, later than the night before, and the rain was audible very faintly against the bedroom window, a soft, steady sound that he found, without really thinking about it, rather soothing, and he fell asleep before he'd finished forming any particular thought about it. Friday arrived the way Fridays generally do, with a faint and mostly unexamined sense of anticipation that Gerald noticed only in the fact that he woke a minute or two before his alarm rather than 3, as though some part of him were slightly more eager to begin the day, though nothing about his actual morning routine changed. He got up, went to the bathroom, brushed his teeth, noted the stubble, deferred the razor, went downstairs, made the coffee, opened the refrigerator, no lemon now, since he'd thrown the bad one away and hadn't yet replaced it, made toast at the same setting of 4, and ate it standing at the counter, looking out at the yard, where the rain from the previous evening had left the grass looking a bit greener than usual and had righted, apparently on its own, or perhaps blown by wind, the plastic chair, which now sat upright again for the first time in what Gerald realized had been almost 2 weeks, a small, unremarked upon restoration of order that he noticed with mild satisfaction before heading upstairs to get dressed. The drive to work was quick that day, only 17 minutes, since it was a Friday and traffic patterns in the area tended to be lighter, for reasons Gerald had never looked into but had simply come to expect over years of driving the same route. The radio played an advertisement for a mattress store, then a traffic report noting no significant delays anywhere nearby, then a song Gerald didn't recognize at all, something newer, that he neither liked nor disliked, simply let play in the background the way he let most songs play in the background. At the office, the mood was, in the mild and understated way that office moods tend to be, slightly lighter than usual, a few more conversations happening near the coffee machine, a few more people commenting on plans for the weekend, though Gerald's own plans for the weekend were modest and mostly domestic, the vacuuming, the dish towel, perhaps a trip to the grocery store, perhaps nothing at all beyond reading and resting, plans that didn't seem worth mentioning to anyone, and that he didn't mention. Though when Doug asked, in the break room, whether he had anything fun planned, Gerald said, "Not really, just some stuff around the house," and Doug nodded and said something about needing to do the same at his own place, and that was the entire exchange. The claims that day were, as they had been all week, small and undramatic: a fence, a section of siding, a bird bath that had been knocked over and cracked. A claim that made Gerald pause for a moment longer than usual, since it was the first bird bath related claim he could recall reviewing in some time, and he found himself, briefly, curious about the bird bath itself, what it had looked like, whether the birds in that particular yard would miss it, before returning his attention to the actual matter at hand, which was simply confirming the repair estimate fell within reasonable limits, which it did, and approving the claim. He finished his queue a little early that day, around 4:40, and spent the remaining 20 minutes tie-dyeing his email inbox, deleting messages he no longer needed, replying briefly to a few that had been sitting unanswered for a day or two. Nothing urgent, just small administrative housekeeping of the kind that accumulates over a busy weekend that felt satisfying to clear away before the weekend. He left at 5:00 on the dot, and the drive home took 19 minutes, the usual time, and the radio played 3 songs he didn't pay much attention to, and he stopped, on the way, at the grocery store near the shopping plaza, the one near the vacuum cleaner parts shop, and he walked through the aisles with a small basket rather than a cart, since he only needed a few things: bread, another carton of eggs, a bag of coffee, a couple of lemons, some more turkey, a fresh dish towel, since he decided, standing in the small household goods aisle, that buying a new one was more appealing than washing the old one, a decision that took him perhaps 4 seconds to make and that he did not regret in the slightest. At the checkout, the cashier, a young woman he didn't recognize, must have been new, scanned his items and made a brief comment about the weather clearing up, and Gerald agreed that it had, and that was the extent of the conversation, and he paid and carried his bags out to the car and drove the remaining few minutes home. That evening, he made himself eggs and toast for dinner, a breakfast for dinner meal he enjoyed every couple of weeks, simple and requiring very little cleanup, and he ate it at the kitchen table with the new dish towel folded neatly on the counter beside the sink, a small, tidy improvement to his kitchen that pleased him in a modest, unremarkable way. He spent the evening finishing the chapter of his book he'd left off at the night before, and then starting another, and he stayed up a little later than usual, until nearly 11, since the next day was a Saturday and there was no alarm to set. He did, eventually, set an alarm anyway, for 8:30, not because he needed to be anywhere but because he'd found, over the years, that sleeping much past that point left him feeling groggy rather than rested, and he preferred a full, unhurried Saturday to a late, rushed one. He turned off the lights, looked once more at the water stain, thought briefly and without any real urgency that he would ask the landlord about it eventually, and fell asleep sometime shortly after, in the quiet, unremarkable way that most of his nights ended, one day folding gently into the next, each one very much like the one before it, and very much like the one that would follow.